The movie The Matrix was a cultural icon, a story about a futuristic freedom fighter named Neo, the main protagonist, alias a good guy. In the beginning of the story, Neo is faced with a life altering decision, a simple choice: take the red pill or the blue pill. According to another lead character, another protagonist, alias another good guy, named Morpheus, if you take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland. Spoiler alert: Neo takes the red pill, the red capsule. After all, there wouldn't be a movie if Neo didn't take the red capsule. Now, if you'll allow me a small latitude, an analogy, aviation safety is the red capsule. The reality: there are those of us who recognize that aviation safety has recently become scarred. There are blemishes and warts, glitches in the safety program. Industry is being fed dangerous information. You see, we're disappointed to discover just who those feeders of dangerous information are. The ones who are feeding this information haven't been looking to corrupt the system. No. Instead, they are only trying to help by forcing reparations that don't work or ideas that have no basis in fact or evidence. It's ignorance from the ignorant. But what about those in the movie who chose the blue capsule? How did their lives go? Well, no need to guess or wait for the next sequel. The answer is right beside you, or on the television, or maybe social media. The answer is definitely in interviews with NTSB board members who believe aviation is safe. You see, those who choose to ignore the symptoms and the signs, like American 5342, Delta 4819, Alaska 1282, and UPS 2976, they just go about their business believing all is good, no problems. The traveling public wants to believe a bureaucrat wearing an NTSB jacket knows all about accident investigations. They're content to let politicians and bureaucrats ignorant of the Bernoulli principle to assure them that everything is okay and the government will fix everything for us. But they know, deep down, this isn't the truth. But they're living in ignorant bliss. So for this podcast episode, come along with me and let's examine what's most dangerous in the aviation industry today. And as Morpheus said, I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Hello, I'm Stephen Carbone, and this is By Reason of Air Safety. The information we'll discuss on this podcast is available on the internet, NTSB archives, Google searches. It's all publicly accessible. I like to keep these podcasts professional. I don't believe in mocking those who pretend to be knowledgeable about aviation issues. However, I need an adjective to refer to those who are trying to negatively influence aviation safety without the background to do so. So I'll refer to those who don't know anything about aviation as uninformed. The point of this podcast is to illuminate the arguments of today with what I call a Paul Harvey, or the rest of the story. Paul Harvey was a radio broadcaster who told the other side of famous stories that people never heard or were denied access to. His program, called The Rest of the Story, told listeners unknown parts of famous stories and events. For example, this story came out shortly after Delta Flight 4819 overturned while landing in Toronto on February 17, 2025. Senator Chuck Schumer, who has been an uninformed member of the Congress, tried to make a political attack on re-elected President Trump during the Department of Government Efficiency government worker reductions. The media volley was a weak soundbite, lazy. Schumer didn't put much thought into it. It was aimed at takers of the blue capsule. But the comment was inaccurate for three reasons. For one, the accident occurred in Canada. The FAA has no jurisdiction over Canadian airports. Furthermore, it is unclear what Senator Schumer expected the FAA to do had they been there in Toronto Airport that day. Two, FAA layoffs were not layoffs. That was a deceptive statement. They were requirements for government personnel to return to their offices, that the COVID lockdowns had ended years before. The government employees needed to return to their work locations. Remote work was not permanent, it was temporary. This is spelled out in all remote site work agreements, just like the agreements I signed and honored when I worked for the FAA. And three, the FAA failure to return to work layoffs under President Trump did not equal the numbers of people under the Biden COVID mandate firings. Under Trump, people could keep their jobs if they returned to work. Under Biden, government employees were threatened with termination if they didn't get the COVID vaccine. Was Senator Schumer's comment true? No. Why do people take him seriously? I can't tell you. He doesn't understand the FAA, its mission, or the aviation industry. So why did he make a false statement? Well, that's a good question. It was for political points, not for aviation safety. The comment made us less safe, in fact, because it distracted from the facts. Now, this podcast is being released on February 4th, 2026. A government shutdown has just been averted with government agencies receiving continuing resolutions. This development is interesting because since continuing resolutions and shutdowns are what the federal government uses to cripple aviation safety. The first example I'd like to point to comes on the heels of the latest NTSB hearing for the military Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter collision with American Flight 5342 while on approach to Reagan National Airport. The reason the timing is so unique is because in the wake of the accident hearing, the NTSB demonstrated they were not up to the challenge, confirming it's more important for the board members to draw attention away from the NTSB's decades of investigatory failures by blaming the FAA. The NTSB has made a habit of blaming the FAA. Any good work the FAA has performed gets lost in the blame the FAA rhetoric. Blaming the FAA is like crying wolf. After a while, people tune you out. But there are more important reasons to call out the NTSB's rhetoric. For years, the NTSB has ignored the red capsule. In other words, the NTSB lives outside the reality of the aviation industry. The board long ago became a part of the problem for many reasons, which I'll cover in future episodes. But for now, we'll talk about two reasons. First is because the NTSB is disingenuous. How do I say that? Well, the NTSB knows firsthand how government shutdowns negatively affect safety. Each time the government shuts down, the NTSB and the FAA are, in a sense, furloughed. The NTSB knows this. And while the NTSB knows what furloughing is like, they fail to speak up against the shutdowns that interfere with safety work that is accomplished by the FAA. Furthermore, board members ignore the impact and redirect blame away from politicians and their shutdowns to agencies like the FAA, regulators that are held hostage by government politicians and bureaucrats. The NTSB recognizes the signs and knows why safety failures occur. Yet board members are happy to defer blame everywhere else than on themselves. Each time the federal government shuts down, the consistency of government projects, FAA surveillance, certificate holder oversight, even air traffic control technology gets put off, must be rescheduled, retested because of old data. And consequently, people deeply involved in aviation improvement projects retire or go back to work in the industry out of shutdown frustration. Then there was the COVID shutdown, which affected every government worker's projects, oversight, safety audits. Anything that dedicated government workers tried to fix, the government shutdowns destroyed. And the second reason is because the Congress listens to the NTSB. For some absurd reason, the Congress believes the NTSB is correct in their reports, even though the NTSB defies every word of its regulatory mandate. What mandate? Title 49 CFR Section 831.4 states, the NTSB conducts investigations or has them conducted to determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances relating to an accident. So far, so good. To every very limited amount, the NTSB tries to do this. But let's continue. The NTSB uses these results to determine one or more probable causes of an accident and to issue safety recommendations to prevent or mitigate the effects of a similar accident. And here, the NTSB falls on its collective sword. The NTSB is supposed to issue recommendations to prevent and mitigate the effects of a similar accident so that it doesn't happen again. Where and when had the NTSB recommendations prevented and mitigated similar accidents that keep happening? They still keep happening. Where was the NTSB's root cause analysis? Where were the corrective actions taken? Where were the NTSB's follow-ups that should have prevented Colgan 3407, Air Midwest 5481, National Air Cargo 102, Delta 4819, Colgan 9446, ValueJet 592. How is it the NTSB, who prides itself on being the world's best accident investigatory agency, failed to alert anyone that the air traffic control system had become archaic after decades? That's decades, as in plural, decades of neglect. There are numerous NTSB air traffic control investigators employed by the NTSB. Where were the uninformed NTSB board members who micromanage these accident investigations, who tell us they're on top of things? Why did the ATC system go the way of the Flintstones in the 1990s and no one at the board even noticed? Nobody in the board told anyone. Where were the studies? Where was the board's attention to the regulations, to their mandate? But let's get back to the second point. Congress uses the NTSB as a dupe for accident findings, and therefore Congress bases their uninformed actions on what the NTSB tells them is real. The Congress at this point is trying to pass the Rotorcraft Operations, Transparency, and Oversight Reform Act. Senator Cruz, who is another uninformed senator, is sponsoring the Rotor Act. The Rotor Act will have support from the NTSB's recent hearing into the military Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter collision with American Flight 5342. But here's the rub. The Rotor Act was introduced by Senator Cruz on July 29, 2025. The investigative hearing took place the next day, on July 30th to July 31st, 2025. What was discovered before the NTSB hearing that led to the Rotor Act being initiated? To be clear, bills and acts aren't written overnight. Well, for instance, it probably took Congress 2 weeks to come up with the nifty Rotor acronym for the Rotor Act. Government bills and acts must be thoroughly researched, reviewed, and rewritten for weeks before being introduced. For weeks before the NTSB hearing, the Rotor Act, if properly written, had to have input from aviation professionals, engineers, FAA divisions, and others knowledgeable about topics like ADS-B, military operations, air traffic control, Reagan National Approach Corridors, airline operations, Part 121 certificate management offices, FAA headquarters, etc. This act was not written overnight. It was a long, drawn-out process before evidence was brought forth. In order for safety to be enhanced, accident facts need to be understood. Evidence cannot be diverted away from those who are conducting the investigation. For example, Aviation accidents such as ValueJet 592 led to regulation changes that decreased aviation safety and were factually wrong. In other words, regulation changes from the ValueJet 592 accident made aviation less safe. Why? Because the NTSB recommended millions of dollars be spent by industry and taxpayers to fix something that wasn't broken. And at the same time, the NTSB ignored the very real problems that led to the ValueJet 592 accident. So let's be clear. Congress isn't populated with aviation professionals. So what did Senator Cruz know weeks prior to July 29, 2025, before the NTSB and industry? That he put forth rule changes to Title 14 CFR sections 91.225 and 91.227. This was information the NTSB and its investigation teams did not know. What did Congress withhold from the NTSB? And there lies the problem. Congress people, for whatever political reason, jumping the investigation and effecting rule changes without any facts. The facts of any accident investigation are the property of the NTSB, not anyone who could be influencing members of Congress, such as lobbyists. Why is Congress putting forth rule changes without following the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically Title 5 CFR Section 553, the rulemaking regulations? According to Title 14 CFR Section 91.225, ADSB systems have been required since January 1st, 2020. The American or PSA airliner had ADSB as directed by Title 14 CFR 91.225. Air traffic control was using the correct equipment. So ADSB was working as advertised. It was installed as 91.225 dictated. So the questions that should have been asked were, why did the military helicopter take off? Why did the helicopter fly positive z-axis into the flight path and not away to any point on the compass? What rules or safety procedures did the helicopter pilot not follow? Reagan National Airport opened June 16, 1941. In those 80 plus years, in hundreds of thousands of recorded flights, how many airliners collided with military helicopters in Washington, D.C.? Or for that matter, anywhere? So are we supposed to believe Congress, with its incredible foresight, knows how to fix basically a non-existent problem? Think about this. How would people react if a cargo airliner with two pilots collided with a military helicopter? Or what if two military aircraft collided? Would anyone care? Would there be public outcry? Would victims' families be paraded on national TV? Would NTSB board members be wringing their hands? How does a passenger airliner differ from a cargo airliner? The passenger airliner has more civilian lives aboard. So how did ADSB become an issue before the July 30th NTSB hearing? The NTSB controlled the investigation. Supposedly, the NTSB controlled the evidence. No one should have had access to any accident evidence aside from the NTSB, not even Congress. 2. How did Congress get ADSB information enough to create an act proposal such as the Rotor Act when the evidence wasn't available in the NTSB archives to anyone outside the investigation until January 2026? 3. Why did anyone in the Senate think they were capable, experienced, trained, knowledgeable, and unbiased enough to think themselves qualified to speak to the facts of the accident? 4. How and why did Congress get involved so early when the aviation industry was kept in the dark? And 5. Who benefits from Congress bypassing the rule-writing federal regulations? With the Rotor Act, Congress demonstrated two things. 1, that they gained access to information and evidence not available to the NTSB. They bypassed the NTSB and the Title 49 CFR Section 831.4 investigatory process. And 2, Since Congress did bypass the NTSB, they demonstrated that Congress doesn't need the NTSB, that Congress believes the NTSB investigations should be sidestepped, and that the NTSB doesn't serve a purpose. The Congress didn't wait for the hearing's evidence. They pushed the Rotor Act with little or no investigatory proof. And now, the uninformed Congress will arbitrarily bypass Title V CFR Section 553 rule writing federal regulations to benefit someone. We don't know who that someone is, but someone is benefiting from the rule change. And the traveling public is being used as an emotional audience to help sidestep the regulations. The bottom line is the Rotor Act won't fix the problem. Changing Title 14 CFR Sections 91225 and 91227 won't fix what the NTSB never found. And the Rotor Act will not erase the fact that the U.S. Congress cripples aviation safety by their repeated government shutdowns and forcing the FAA to remain on continuing resolutions. Those are the safety problems. So let's look at another opportunity where uninformed politicians have bypassed the system to bring about agendas. New York Senators Schumer and Gillibrand, both senators from New York, pushed hard for the Aviation Safety and FAA Extension Act of 2010, grabbing headlines with the families of the crash of Colgan 3407 and other high-profile people to push the FAA Extension Act forward. Both senators are uninformed senators of aviation information. But let's be honest, Senator Schumer, Gillibrand, and anyone in either chamber of the House wouldn't know a radome from an empennage. Many of the Colgan 3407 accident facts didn't support the probable cause and never would have supported the accident's root causes. In other words, the two senators forced changes that did nothing to prevent a similar accident. The Colgan 3407 accident report, AAR 1001's probable cause, stated that the NTSB determines the probable cause of this accident was the captain's inappropriate response to the activation of the stick shaker, which led to the aerodynamic stall from which the plane did not recover. Contributing to the accident were 1. The flight crew's failure to monitor airspeed in relation to the rising position of the low-speed cue. 2. The flight crew's failure to adhere to sterile cockpit procedures. 3. Captain's failure to effectively manage the flight. And 4. Colgan Air's inadequate procedures for airspeed selection and management during approaches and icing conditions. The NTSB never recognized the differences between regional airlines and mainline airlines. As with previous accident investigations, like I said before, Air Midwest 5481, Colgan 9446, and Brit Airways 2574, the NTSB never understood or considered regional airline financial problems with regards to maintenance, fleet safety, ramp operations, and pilot staging. Colgan was one of several regional airlines contracted to fly routes for Continental Airlines, which was the mainline airline. Colgan was subject to Continental's scheduling, domicile choices, contract limitations, and route expectations. Colgan was on a contractual budget. Continental didn't compensate Colgan for flight failures or system delays. Colgan pilots didn't have the financial benefits Continental or any mainline pilots had. Colgan's pilots' salaries were low, which prevented them from living near their flight domicile. Furthermore, the report and its probable cause gave great attention to the captain of Flight 3407, but virtually ignored the first officer. When we talk about safety of flight, the first officer is one half the cockpit flight crew. First officer is not only responsible for their own actions, but also, with cockpit resource management, the actions of the captain, to question decisions if necessary, to challenge checklists, and to take over in an emergency. The FO's, the first officer's existence, cannot be trivialized. And yet the NTSB ignored the FO's condition. The first officer's husband said the first officer normally slept through the night between 11 and 2300 and 1300 Eastern Time. That was a 10-hour period. She began her day around 1300 Eastern Time the day before the accident. We're using Eastern Time because the accident happens in Eastern Standard Time. So she began her day around 1300 Eastern Standard Time the day before the accident. Her connecting flights from her home in Seattle to Newark were on FedEx flights that operated overnight, the times she normally slept. She flew 5 hours from Seattle to Memphis and 3 hours from Memphis to Newark, from which she didn't gain fitful sleep. She had a 3-hour layover, was in the FedEx jump seat building off Democrat Road in Memphis. This facility also doesn't allow for fitful sleep because it's loud, well lit, and if one doesn't hear their flight called, they'll miss their connection. So the first officer arrived in Newark before her first flight, already fatigued and off her sleep pattern. When she arrived at Newark, she had been awake for over 18 hours and would be up for another 16 hours until the accident. That's 34 straight hours with no chance to sleep, and in addition, she was ill, which added to her fatigue and lack of situational awareness. The NTSB finding number 24 stated, the pilot's performance was likely, remember the word likely, impaired because of fatigue, but the extent of their impairment and the degree to which it contributed to the performance deficiencies that occurred during the flight cannot be conclusively determined. The word likely is not factual. It's an opinion. It offsets the point of the finding. Opinions don't belong in findings. This statement made clear the NTSB was not paying attention, that they lacked industry experience to recognize fatigue as a factor. NTSB recommendation Alpha-10-16 was a blanket recommendation that ignored regional carriers and pushed for the FAA to exercise powers the FAA did not have. The FAA is regulatory. The FAA does not manage operator hiring practices or dictate pilot policy. The NTSB didn't understand the FAA's mission. Instead, the NTSB, the board, tried to capture every operator in a recommendation that should have addressed specific operators, regional airlines. Again, the NTSB didn't understand the industry. In the FAA Extension Act of 2010, it was Congress's turn to have no clue about industry. Under Section 211, the Act dictated issues relating to the regional airline fatigue. However, the established reviews covered time zone crossings, multiple time zones, takeoffs and landings, time of day duty times, alternative alertness procedures, and rest environments. Ironically, the Colgan 3407 accident occurred in a single time zone, the Eastern Standard Time Zone. It was obvious to all concerned Congress was spitballing. Politicians had no clue what had happened with Colgan 3407. They received bad information from the NTSB and now had made promises to grieving family members on television. They had no choice but to get creative. The first officer's fatigue was one example of regional operational problems that were ignored. The NTSB's failure to recognize regional operational issues were overlooked with the Brit Airways 2574 accident, the Air Midwest 5481 accident, and the Colgan 9446 accident. Colgan 3407 was no different. It was the latest lack of investigatory awareness the NTSB demonstrated, and 49 people died. This time. As a result, Senators Schumer and Gillibrand crusaded to use the Colgan 3407 accident as an agenda for votes from New York airport employees for whom they acquired funding. That was part of the 2010 Act. Both senators pushed the Aviation Safety and FAA Extension Act of 2010 through by exploiting accident family losses, using emotional sales points instead of facts, and using incorrect investigation findings. Some of the FAA Extension Act's notices pushed by Congress mischaracterized the problems found in the accident, while others placed responsibility for reform in the hands of the unqualified. For instance, Section 208 of the 2010 Act called for all Part 121 operators to provide crew members with ground training and flight simulator training for stall recognition. To be clear, there are two reasons why this is ludicrous. For one, Colgan 3407's captain transitioned to the Q400, the accident aircraft, less than 4 months before the accident. That the captain fought the stall recovery was obviously a result of his training deficit. Congress and the NTSB failed to understand this evident failure on the accident captain's part. And two, required all Part 121 operators to retrain all their pilots for stall recognition, ignored the fact that all Part 121 pilots were regularly trained on stall recognition on different airliner models as part of their FAA-approved training for many years. The NTSB, and by association the Congress, in their ignorance, decided to punish all airlines for a mistake that Congress and the NTSB made in recognizing what happened when they failed to understand what were Colgan's training issues. Another example of the ineptitude of the FAA Extension Act was the FAA was to submit reports to the House of Representatives Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and NTSB, two groups that had no knowledge of how to interpret the data in the report, no experience with the topic of regional airlines, and nor anyone in authority that could make use of the findings. During the FAA Extension Act's writing and existence, no one in Congress or the NTSB examined the FAA to verify the FAA had the proper funding and resources to carry out their normal functions and the requirements of the Act. The true roadblock to the FAA's ability to provide adequate oversight was finances and resources, such as manpower. Congress and the NTSB did nothing to help this. By using faulty NTSB information and assuming Congress people are smarter than they think they are, Senators Schumer, Gillibrand, and many in Congress wasted time and allowed the root cause of an accident to be misidentified. Again, the resulting congressional fix was a wasted effort that made aviation less safe. This is what happens in cases when Congress gets involved in issues they don't understand. The politicians manipulate the tragic accident and don't think about the best way to fix the problem. The aviation industry repeats the problem. More people die, and we're back to square one again with victim families being exploited for political gain. These are only two examples of how politicians and bureaucrats have corrupted safety, blamed others for what they did to harm safety integrity, and then advertised themselves as the sole advocates of safety. 1. By shutting down the government and hobbling the FAA with continuing resolutions, Congress and their lobbyists have crippled the FAA's effectiveness in promoting aviation safety. 2. By misrepresenting safety failures with an uninformed lack of experience, Congress and their lobbyists have sold Americans useless solutions that have done more harm and no good. These politicians and their lobbyists are rewriting aviation law without consent by the industry or the FAA. Politicians are displacing facts with feelings, pitting evidence against emotions, and claiming the high ground in doing so. Yet how many rules have been changed in the past in this fashion? And how many more will be changed against the will of those in the aviation industry? Politicians keep playing the emotional card. Their angle is, we must make changes to improve safety and to save lives. But accident investigations aren't about victim death tolls. In fact, victims have nothing to do with an investigation. Victims serve no place in the gathering of facts. Furthermore, accident investigations aren't about saving lives. Not even close. Accident investigations are to determine the cause of the accident, to prevent pilots and mechanics, flight attendants, ramp crews, air traffic controllers, and manufacturers from making unsafe mistakes, and taking unsafe actions. And by preventing unsafe actions, lives are protected from harm. That's why Title 49 CFR Section 831.4 was written the way it was, to prevent or mitigate the effects of similar accidents. And to anyone who believes uninformed politicians are trying to improve aviation safety by forcing rule changes without industry input, let me quote another Matrix character who stated, "Ignorance is bliss." The bottom line is, we can accept the reality that politicians and bureaucrats are destroying every last vestige of aviation safety. Or you can choose to ignore the signs, live your life in total ignorance of the dangers around you. That choice is yours. Until next time, I am Stephen Carbone reminding you to tab. Think safe, act safe, be safe. God bless.